Let's begin now with MS Now White House reporter Laura Barone-Lopez traveling in Beijing with the president, China historian and NSC senior director for China under President Biden, Julian Gewirtz, and State Department official Anja Manuel, who worked on Asia policy. Laura, has Xi's warning, pretty stark warning there, about Taiwan affected the mood of this summit and President Trump's high hopes here?
Well, I will have to say that so far, because of the fact that there have not been any deliverables that we've received or that the White House has announced or that China has announced, it's hard to say how it can affect what ultimately comes of this summit. But the president has still been heaping his praise on Xi Jinping, has been calling him a friend multiple times over, and which you saw in the clips that you just played. But we did just get some kind of response from the administration, because we had been asking, my producer Lindsay Papia and I had been asking the White House what exactly the president said inside that bilateral meeting and whether or not he responded to Xi's warning that the U.S.-Chinese relationship could be in jeopardy over the U.S.'s position on Taiwan and Taiwan independence. And the White House did not answer those questions at all directly. Instead, a senior administration official told MS Now that both sides reiterated their long-stated stance on the issue and everyone understands each other's position. So indicating that the U.S. position is not necessarily changing, but still the only administration official publicly here in Beijing to say that is not the president, Ariel, it's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who made similar comments to NBC.
Julian, I want to play what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC about Taiwan overnight.
President Trump is understands the issues here and understands the sensitivities around all this. And anyone who's been saying otherwise does not understand the negotiating style of Donald Trump.
And there are immense sensitivities around this. There's reporting that allies are concerned Trump could make an off-the-cuff remark that could intentionally, unintentionally change U.S. foreign policy towards Taiwan. What's your gauge on all of this?
It's great to be with you. Look, no one doubts that President Trump understands the sensitivity at this point for China, for Beijing, for Xi Jinping around the Taiwan issue. He's made clear many times that he does see the issue through that prism. What I'm concerned about, and many people in Asia and elsewhere are concerned about, is whether President Trump understands the U.S. commitments to Taiwan, which are a matter of Congress having passed a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that requires us to continue providing forms of support to Taiwan. And, my hope very much is that he does, but I think it's legitimate to ask whether in those private conversations with Xi Jinping, he showed that consistent U.S. position, or if he was more interested in talking about other topics and didn't reiterate those core positions.
So speaking of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, Anja, Trump announced an $11 billion weapons package for Taiwan back in December, but that is still in limbo. Explain how it would fundamentally change the future of Taiwan and impact the Asia-Pacific region if it doesn't actually go through.
It would be a real problem if we didn't give Taiwan the arms that it needs, especially because the Taiwanese are finally doing the things that the United States has argued for years. They're buying drones, more attritable systems. They're doing things to really defend themselves in case there is a conflict with China. And as Julian said, the White House and others in the administration have signaled consistently that they're not going to change U.S. policy towards Taiwan, but we've heard very little about these arms sales. And I would just add, Ariel, the most important thing that's happening in this summit is not what's going on in Beijing right now, which is mostly pomp and very little substance. What's happening is that on Donald Trump's watch, China is accelerating in all of the areas where they can be really competitive with us. They're accelerating their lead in critical technologies. They're getting on par with us in AI. They are dominating in the developing world where we have pulled back from U.S. aid. So a lot of what's actually going on here isn't happening in Beijing right now.
Laura, this is, of course, also all happening as the specter of the Iran war looms large. Trump is pushing for China to try to pressure Iran, at least to open the Strait of Hormuz at maximum, to try to leverage its relationship with Iran to bring this all to a close. Take us into that dimension of these talks. Have we learned anything more there?
Well, what's stunning is that the information we have gotten out of this bilateral meeting, which went nearly 2 hours today, is that that was the issue that the White House focused on, that they said that the president and his delegation talked about with Xi Jinping. They made no mention of Taiwan in their readout, but they repeatedly said that Xi Jinping agreed that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon, and that he also felt that the Strait of Hormuz should be reopened. But again, there's no agreement that leads to actual action on that front. And you can't really separate the Taiwan question and the Iran question, because ultimately a number of national security former ones that I've spoken to, including John Bolton, who served in President Trump's first term, has said that President Trump doesn't necessarily care about doesn't necessarily care about Taiwan. That's Bolton's view, and he worked with President Trump and for President Trump. And so he's concerned that ultimately the president may give away things on Taiwan in order to get China's help on Iran. Ariel.
Julian, you wrote in the New York Times that Xi has Trump right where he wants him. So does the president have any leverage here to try to pressure China to help when it comes to the Iran conflict? Is there a risk that Trump could look too reliant on Beijing during these talks and beyond?
Look, the United States has tremendous leverage over China if it wants to use it. And I think the core problem with the current administration's approach in this respect is that they have shown that they are too worried about other aspects of the relationship and too desiring of a big economic deal to use the leverage that they have over China, which ranges from semiconductor choke points to the dominance of the U.S. dollar in the international financial system. To my mind, the core takeaway from this summit so far is that the United States has been stalemated by China, and that President Xi Jinping has been preparing for years to bring an American president to Beijing as a true peer and be acknowledged as such by the world. And that is precisely what this visit so far has been showing.
Anja, you can answer that or agree or disagree with that comment. And then I also want to ask you, you've said that Trump can't have a trade conversation with the Chinese without talking about AI. Explain that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a very small silver lining to this visit, and that is that at the last minute, we were told from Washington that the topic of artificial intelligence will be on the table, and that the United States and China may restart those government-to-government talks that the Biden administration started on AI. And that might be the best thing that comes out of this summit, not because the U.S. and China are going to agree on restraining the frontier models, we're going to agree to restrict certain things, but because just like in the Cold War, the U.S. talked to the Soviet Union to understand their thinking, to understand where the red lines are, to make sure there's no miscalculation in a crisis. So to my view, I haven't heard anything coming out of the summit about this AI track, but if it happens, to my view, that is the best thing that can happen there.
So, Julian, quickly before we go, you had to fight to finally get AI security on the agenda between Biden and Xi in 2024. Why do you believe that there's now seemingly more of a willingness to discuss this issue?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. Scott Bessent just said that the reason he believes this issue has finally been able to get back on the agenda is that the United States has such a lead over China on AI right now, that's his belief. What is particularly ironic about that, though, is that on this trip, in addition to these very important potential talks that Anja referred to, which I agree are critical, the United States has also brought the leader of NVIDIA, and they are working to sell more advanced chips to China, which will cause that lead that the United States has to shrink. So there's a bit of a paradox here. Do we want AI safety talks where the United States is in the lead, or do we want to sell chips to China and help them catch up to us? That's really one of the open questions coming out of this summit.
Laura Barone-Lopez, thank you so much for joining us there from China. And Julian Gewirtz and Anja Manuel, thank you so much for your insights.